Hello, world! We are live again, I think. Almost getting there. Oh my gosh. Okay. So here we go as I now get set up and make sure I've got everything set the way it needs to be set. Hello to everybody who's tuning in later. Thanks for always putting up with this couple of seconds of me getting organized before we get going. Okay. So we're doing this Bible study earlier than we've done them in the past. We've done them in the evenings in the past, and this one is during an earlier part of the day. So we'll see how many people show up. The idea was that I had some requests from folks that are in other time zones and folks that have different schedules for the day. And they kind of said, hey, could we do one of these Bible study things earlier in the day so that I can be involved? And I thought I would give it a shot. So we're doing this one earlier than we normally do, and hopefully that's okay with folks. We'll see how the sort of reaction goes. Like if people want to switch back to doing, I'm going to plan to after this one go back to doing evenings for a little bit. But if people are really interested and want to keep going on these afternoon ones, then maybe we'll switch it off every once in a while. So let me know how you feel about the time change. Right now I have my dog sitting here bothering me, so if you hear him rustling around in the background, let's see. Okay, so we've got that up, and I'm going to put a link here over in the Twitter. Okay. Okay. One of the things that I love about being able to do this live stuff is that I get to actually interact with you all as we're doing things. But one of the hard parts is trying to organize this so that people know it's happening, and you're just sitting there staring at my face while I do that. So, there we go. Okay. So hi, friends. Say hi in the chat. Who have we got in here today? Let me know your name, your pronouns, anything that you want me to know about you as we get going here. Because it's so much more fun to talk with you all in the chat than me just talking to the camera. I'm glad you're here. We got a couple of folks tuning in already. So what I was hoping that we could talk about today was, or is rather, Psalm 27. And I've made a video about Psalm 27 in the past. So it's in the Trans and Christian video list somewhere. I've talked about this before, but it's one of my favorite Psalms. And it's a Psalm that I think is really encouraging and helpful in difficult times, and especially for LGBTQ plus folks. And I'll talk about why I kind of feel that way in a little bit. But it's a Psalm that gives me some encouragement and some hope. And it just feels like there are people are dealing with a lot of tough stuff right now, and especially because of if you're sort of keeping up with the trans military ban thing that's happening. That's such a complicated subject, because I think probably a lot of people, I have complicated feelings about it, because on the one hand, I am pretty opposed to the idea of military action in almost every situation. But on the other hand, I want to appreciate the folks that are putting themselves in harm's way to do something that's helpful for others. And so in some cases, it's I have that appreciation for the military then, but then also just the recognition that this case is not just about trans people in the military. It's about, do trans people get the same rights as every other US citizen? And so it's complicated, because many of us probably have complicated feelings about the military, but this is, I think, in general, more of a question of what rights are trans people given or allowed. So complicated feelings about that. But I know that for a lot of us, we might feel especially frustrated or especially disappointed or angry or sad about what's going on in terms of like the Supreme Court upholding this decision to not allow trans folks in the military in the US. And while that's not the end of the discussion, there are still court cases in the works that we'll see if this actually is upheld. But in general, there's sort of a sense of the morale is just low because of this, and so when I was thinking about what Bible study we could look at today or what Bible passage we could look at today, I wanted something that would give us a little bit of courage and hope in the face of that. And so Psalm 27 is where I got to. So yeah, like I said before, if you are a person that's watching and you want to say hi in the chat, definitely put yourself in the chat because I want to hear from you all about what you think about this passage. And if you want to introduce yourself with your name or your pronouns or anything you want to say about yourself, definitely do that in the chat. So Psalm 27. It's kind of a long one, and I'll give you well, it's not long in terms of psalms. I suppose it's a medium-sized psalm. And it's a psalm that's like toward the beginning of the book of Psalms. A lot of these psalms in the beginning of the book are ascribed to David. And so I think a lot of us, when we think of the Psalms, we think of them as all being written by David, right? So not all of them are ascribed to David, but some of them toward right at the beginning of the psalm will say of David, or the tricky thing about, this is your little Hebrew geeky moment of the day. The tricky thing about Hebrew prepositions is that they can mean multiple things. So it could mean of David or to David or for David, or it could mean a lot of things, but we got the David part solid, at least in the English. So this psalm is of David, Psalm 27, and it's categorized as a psalm of trust or a psalm of praise, but it's also definitely a psalm of maybe a psalm of struggle would be a good way to put it. And so I'm going to read through this psalm really quick, and then we're going to talk a little bit about it and like a little bit about the translation and all that kind of stuff. So here's Psalm 27. The Lord is my light and my help. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Whom shall I dread? When evil men assail me to devour my flesh, it is they, my foes and my enemies, who stumble and fall. Should an army besiege me, my heart would have no fear. Should war beset me, still I would be confident. One thing I ask of the Lord, only that do I seek, to live in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord, to frequent his temple. He will shelter me in his pavilion on an evil day, grant me the protection of his tent, and raise me high upon a rock. Now my head is high over my enemies round about. I sacrifice in his tent with shouts of joy, singing and chanting a hymn to the Lord. Hear, O Lord, when I cry aloud. Have mercy on me and answer me. On your behalf, my heart says, seek my face. O Lord, I seek your face. Do not hide your face from me. Do not thrust aside your servant in anger. You have ever been my help. Do not forsake me. Do not abandon me, O God, my deliverer. Though my father and mother abandon me, the Lord will take me in. Show me your way, O Lord, and lead me on a level path because of my watchful foes. Do not subject me to the will of my foes, for false witnesses and unjust accusers have appeared against me. Had I not the assurance that I would enjoy the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living, look to the Lord, be strong and of good courage. Oh, look to the Lord. So that translation might be a little bit different from one that you've read before. This is the translation of Psalm 27 from the Jewish Publication Society, the JPS version. I was reading this out of my Jewish study Bible. I love reading different versions, different translations of these texts because different translations will pull out different important words, or they translate different words differently, right? And usually when I'm reading in these Bible studies, I read from the NRSV, the New Revised Standard Version. And so that version might be one that you're a little bit more familiar with, or you might be familiar with the New International Version maybe, or maybe even the King James Version. the Jewish Publication Society, the great thing about them is that they've got the Hebrew on lock. So they know what they're doing when it comes to Hebrew translation. And I really appreciate that. There are certain ways that parts of this piece of text are translated that I feel a little bit weird about. Like there's that section towards the end, verse 13, where it said, "Had I not the assurance that I would enjoy the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living," and it sort of trails off like it's supposed to be sort of a rhetorical question. Like, man, if I didn't believe this stuff was true, I don't know what I'd do, you know? And in the NRSV version, it's more of a declarative statement. I know that I will enjoy the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living, period. And it's more of a declarative statement. And so you can see just there, like in the differences in translation, that it kind of, for some folks, one translation is going to ring more true, or they're going to resonate more with one translation over the other. Like I resonate more with the translation that feels a little bit uncertain, or I resonate more with the translation that feels like a declarative statement, like, yes, I know this, and it is the thing I'm holding on to. So yeah, check out different translations of these texts as we read them, because they're going to have different strong points. So Psalm 27. The notes here in the text about what this psalm is, it says, a psalm of trust. The psalmist has no fear of enemies in the protective refuge of the temple. So from the position of somebody who, like David, if this was a psalm written by David, then it would have been written during the time when there was a temple, theoretically, and because there would have been a small temple, it wouldn't have been the big, like Solomon's temple. That was the first big temple, but there would have been a smaller temple, and so this sort of focus around being in God's house and being and sacrificing in the temple is really important for the psalmist at this point. It also says here that there are a couple of notes specifically on different bits of this text. But the one that I like here, and the reason that I find this psalm so helpful for LGBT folks, is because of verse 10. And verse 10 says, though my father and mother abandon me, the Lord will take me in. And that specific verse is something that I think can be a sort of a foothold for LGBT folks that have experienced rejection because of their identity. Not all of us have parents that are super affirming of us. And so this idea of like, even if my parents don't get it, or even if there's some tension between us, or all the way to like my parents reject me completely, even then God will take you up. And the note on this particular verse says, even if the psalmist's parents abandon him through death or otherwise, the psalmist will have a divine parent that will protect and instruct him. The motif of the God as parent of the king is familiar from Mesopotamian hymns and elsewhere in biblical literature, where God is the superlative parent. So it's kind of I know that some of us have kind of weird feelings about God as father in some cases. I know a lot of us have. There's a tough thing where if we are in a position where our parents have abandoned us in some way, and then to associate God with a parent, there can be some negative associations there, right? But I think the thing that is strong about this text, verse 10 of Psalm 27, is this idea that like God is like a parent to us, but not like our parents. Even if our parents, abandon us in some way, God will be there as the good parent, as a parent who can be there for us when our birth parents or our birth family can't be. And I feel like that's something that we can hold on to if we need to. The other verse here that I always kind of gets me is verse 12, where it says, do not subject me to the will of my foes, for false witnesses and unjust accusers have appeared before me. And I want to check what that is in the NRSV, because I think it's a slightly different translation. But I love that unjust accusers. I don't think that's in the NRSV. I If somebody wants to pop into chat and tell me what it is, that'd be great, but I'm going to look it up here too. So in the NRSV, it's do not give me up to the will of my adversaries, for false witnesses have risen against me, and they are breathing out violence. So you can kind of give that sense there. I really like false witnesses and unjust accusers, but I also like the visual of breathing out violence. So the reason why I kind of pull that verse out is I think as we're dealing with in the media, the sort of argument about trans folks in the military and arguments about, should trans people have certain human rights, this idea of unjust accusers is something that that rings true for me. I think people that, not necessarily people that are that have bad information, that just don't really know much about trans folks, but people who are intentionally spreading misinformation about trans folks. So people that are intentionally talking about, how dangerous trans people are to kids, or how trans women shouldn't be allowed in bathrooms and things like that. Like people that are intentionally spreading misinformation about trans folks. Those are kind of the people that I read into this bit of the text about unjust accusers. And so for me, kind of combining those two ideas as I read this text, I start to think about how does this sense of trust in God play out for me in my life when these things are happening, when I'm dealing with maybe birth family members not getting it, or when I'm dealing with unjust accusers in sort of a larger societal sense. How do I hold on to what the psalmist has here, which is a trust that God will take you up, and a trust that that you will, kind of like I said with verse 13 there, how do I both become okay with the sort of the unknowing of verse 13. Had I not the assurance that I would enjoy the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living, how do I deal with sort of the trying to believe or the trying to hope in that passage? Does that make sense? Or how do I move to a more solid sense of a declarative statement, like I know that I will enjoy the goodness of the Lord in the house of the Lord forever? How do I either be okay with the wanting to have the faith, or do I move to a more declarative sense of that? Does that make sense? I don't think I maybe explained that very well, but I think for me, this psalm comes down to this situation sounds familiar. How do I hold on to the kind of faith that the psalmist has? Maybe that's an easier way of saying that. So that's kind of the sort of question that I'm throwing out there for all of us today. How do we hold on to the hope and the courage? I'm reticent to use the word faith because I think we tend to use that word to just kind of have faith, don't think about it too much, just believe, it's kind of like telling an anxious person to just calm down and chill out. It doesn't really work. So I'm hesitant to use the word faith, but how do we hold on to the hope and the courage that the psalmist has in this passage? So that's kind of where I'm at on that. And I want to make sure, there we go. I want to make sure that I can see. Oh my gosh, you guys, y'all, sorry, not guys. I just popped out the chat and you guys have been writing in chat and I haven't been able to see it this whole time. Here, I just thought you were all being so quiet. Hold on a second, I have to fix this. Hi, Kayla from Discord. Hi, Danielle. Yay, Psalm 27. Okay. Albie is here for this. And Nikki, yeah. Okay. Thank you for putting that in there, Nikki. Sorry I didn't see it right away. Now I can see the chat as y'all are talking. I'm so sorry that I wasn't able to see that before. Sometimes YouTube just doesn't want me to see things. So that's where I am in terms of this text? How do we hold on to the hope and the trust in this text? So I want us to, I think, let's see. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up a couple of different translation differences in these texts, and I want us to give me I'm going to read you two verses, one verse, one of each translation, and I'm hoping you can give me feedback on which version resonates more with you, and why, if you want to add that as well, because I think some of this is going to resonate with some people more than others. So let's try that. Okay. Where is it here? Okay, so verse 5 here. Verse 5 in the JPS version says, God will shelter me in his pavilion on an evil day, grant me the protection of his tent, and raise me high upon a rock. So that's version 1. The NRSV says, for he will hide me in his shelter on the day of trouble. He will conceal me under the cover of his tent. He will set me high on a rock. So there's not a ton of difference there, but is there anything about how that verse talks about God that either like strikes you positively or doesn't strike you as well? I think one of the things that I appreciate about this text is how, like, the idea of being set up on a rock out of the sort of the fray going on around you is a helpful metaphor for me, I think, because one of the things that I have a hard time with in some of these Psalms, and I think in the Bible in general, one of the things I have a hard time with is when there's sort of these vindication moments of like, yeah, cut down all my enemies, kill all those bad people. Like that makes me feel super uncomfortable because I don't want to like wish harm on somebody, even if maybe I kind of feel a little bit like that inside. I don't want to like put that out there. And so I always kind of feel a little bit weird about that. But this idea of being sheltered and being raised up high on a rock out of that fray feels like something that I can ask God for, if that makes sense. Like that is a sort of petition prayer that I can, like, that resonates with me about like, hey, I'm in the middle of this like war that is raging and all I need is just some time to be up out of that for a little bit. Like I just need a little bit of a rest. And so to be put high on a rock out of that fray really resonates with me as something that like would be, that I would ask God for. Like, can I just have a moment of being up on a rock for a little bit? So that's one of the verses out of this text that really resonates with me. So my question for all of you, is there a bit of this Psalm 27, that a verse or a line or a metaphor that resonates with you and is something that you find helpful? There's my question. So I'm going to put that out to chat now that I can actually see you. Yeah, I think one of the other things that that I find interesting about this text, or that really strikes me, is verse 4, where it says, one thing I ask of the Lord, only that do I seek, to live in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to frequent his temple. And in the NRSV, it says, one thing I have asked of the Lord, that I will seek after, to live in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple. That to me has always been like a really, it's just really beautiful, I think, to me. This idea of like, I only want one thing, and that is to just be in the house of the Lord. And like I said at the beginning, this psalm would have been written at a time when like temple worship and the creation of the temple was central to the theology of the people of Israel, right? And so this really does mean like, no, I just want to be in the actual temple. But for us, who are outside of that context, I wonder what that means for us to live in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, and to frequent God's temple. What does that mean for us? Since we don't have that cultural context, we don't have that physical context. And so we might think of it as, to be in the house of the Lord might be to be in church. It might mean to be in like a physical building. But it also might be something else. So what does it mean to y'all to live in the house of the Lord all the days of my life and to frequent his temple? What does that mean to you? I think to me, it means to be, I don't know, I kind of connect it with, this is kind of a weird connection because I'm jumping from the Old Testament to the New Testament, and we have to be careful when we do that. But for me, I connect it to Jesus's Sermon on the Mount, where he's talking about, blessed are so-and-so, blessed are the meek, blessed are the poor, and he does all these blessed ares, right? And Jesus says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. And I really connect that to this idea of one thing I ask of the Lord, to live in the house of the Lord all the days of my life. Those ideas are connected for me, this idea of hungering and thirsting for righteousness. And righteousness is kind of a weird word, I think, for us, like in English, because righteousness can seem like we connect it to things like somebody who is being self-righteous, meaning like you think you're better than everybody else. And, what else do we connect righteousness to? To just people who are kind of up on their high horse about being the best, sort of morally or ethically or spiritually. And so we have a weird relationship maybe to that word. But the idea of hungering and thirsting for righteousness, righteousness in sort of biblical contexts, in sort of a Old Testament Hebrew context, to be righteous, like if sometimes in the Bible, in the Old Testament, specifically in Hebrew, they will talk about a righteous path, to be on a righteous path. And I remember my Hebrew professor telling us that a righteous path just meant a path that goes to the place that you think it's supposed to go. A righteous path is just a righteous path, or righteous thing is something that is doing what it's supposed to do. So if you see a road sign that says 10 miles to Rome and you walk down that path and it goes to Rome, that's a righteous path because it's just doing what it's supposed to do. So when we think about righteousness in sort of that context, people that hunger and thirst for righteousness might be people that that really have this deep sense of wanting to do what they're supposed to do. Wanting to do what God is calling them to do. And there are other ways that that Sermon on the Mount has been translated, like hunger and thirst for justice, which is like, I'm not sure how accurate that connection is there, just because I'm not as familiar with Greek as I am with Hebrew. But this idea of like hungering and thirsting for what you are supposed to do in the world and what God is calling you to do. And I connect that to this idea of wanting to be in the house of the Lord and to be doing whatever it is that you're supposed to be doing. Allie says, to me, living in the house of the Lord means that we aren't slaves anymore, but we are part of God's family, and that there's a relationship change to that of a father and a daughter. Yeah, so Allie, that's sort of a familial connection that connects us to verse 10, where it talks about, even if my father and mother abandon me, the Lord will take me in. So you're connecting that idea to family. You're connecting it to the idea of a house, right? Where people live. I love that. I think for me, growing up in a context that talked about a father God in a way that was not the best, I have weird relationship ideas about like the idea of God as a father, but God as a parent in sort of a more gender neutral sense, or maybe even God as a mother. Like personally, that strikes me a little bit more, but I really like the idea that strikes for you. Luke says, I heard someone say once about how they love people who see the future more than the present. My immediate thought about the verse would be seeing the world through the vision or idea of the kingdom of heaven, sort of living in heaven but on earth. Not sure how to explain it. No, Luke, that kind of does make sense. This idea of seeing the kingdom of heaven or living in that kingdom on earth. I think I think we're kind of connecting to New Testament stuff, but like the Lord's Prayer, right? On earth as it is in heaven. This idea of bringing this, like if you ask to live in the house of the Lord forever, it may be that you are living in this sort of like away place where you are safe in God's house, or it may be that we are making the rest of the world more of a place for God to live. Like maybe outside of the idea of the temple, maybe we are working with God to make the whole world God's house. So there's this sort of like the bringing the future into the space as well. So maybe I'm probably not doing any better job explaining that than you are, but I like that vision. Albie says, God is parental to me, but not gendered. Yeah. So what sort of things do we ascribe to a parent God that might not be specifically gendered, or might be sort of beyond the ideas of gender? Does that make sense? Like, for instance, I think of God as compassionate and caring, and like as a parental figure, I think of God as sort of soft and kind. And those are all sort of things that we tend to associate with women, but they don't have to be, like that doesn't have to connect there. Ali says, what Luke is saying also connects with verse 13, where it says, I would have fainted if I did not believe that I would see the goodness of Jehovah in the land of the living. So that's another translation there. I love bringing in the other translations. So there's that idea of sort of an oasis, or a place of goodness that might be in one particular place, or it might be more places. Albie says omniscient as a characteristic of a parental God. That one is so interesting. I could just do like a whole conversation on like attributes of God and how we understand things like omniscience. But I won't get on my soapbox about it, but I love that. What other characteristics do we think of when we think of a parental God? Are there characteristics that are comforting to us? I'm sticking to the comforting thing because I think that's where this psalm is going, is this idea of a comforting parental God who brings us into God's house. And Ali, going back to what you said there about like living in the house of the Lord as part of God's family, I really like that connection. Sometimes I think it's easy for biblical scholars to look at this stuff and read things like the house of the Lord and immediately be like, yes, the temple in Jerusalem. When other people read it and they're like, the house of the Lord, like a house where families live. And like, I forget to think about it in that context because I'm so used to thinking about like, whatever the historical construct is. I'm wondering about verse 8, and I'm going to read verse 8 in the NRSV here. Verse 8 says, come, my heart says, seek his face. Your face, Lord, do I seek. And then 9 says, do not hide your face from me. And I've been thinking about that, this idea of seeking God's face. And I wonder what that means to you all, because it's such an interesting way of talking about seeing God, especially because in the Hebrew Bible, you don't see God's face unless you're going to die. Seeing God's face is like really dangerous in the Hebrew Bible. So I wonder how the psalmist meant this idea of I seek your face. Is the idea to be in like such an intimate relationship with God that you actually can see God's face and know God as sort of, I was going to say a person, but God's not really a person, but like on an I and thou sort of basis, like to really know God personally, I think is what I'm trying to say. Or does it mean, to seek who God really is? Does it mean, what does it mean to seek God's face? Question for you all. I think, I think I'm looking here at verse 8 because I've got a little note here that says meaning of Hebrew uncertain in this verse. So you got to love when the meaning of the Hebrew is uncertain. Rainbow Eclipse says, I see it in the Hebrew sense. Why? Seeing God's face. Yeah, so that idea of seeing God's face can sound kind of scary and like why would you want to do that? Is that kind of what you're saying? Albie says, what is God's face? Is it when we can reflect and see the Holy Spirit moving? Yeah, so Albie, you've kind of got this idea of like maybe seeing God's face through other places in creation. Is that kind of what you're saying? Like the idea of seeing God in others and seeing God in creation and in the world? I like that idea too. Rainbow, yeah, I get what you're saying there. That idea of like a fear of seeing God is definitely something that would be in the text. So that's why it's so interesting that the psalmist here is like, yes, I want to do that. I want to see God's face. I want to be close to God in that way. And then, of course, in verse 9, it says, do not hide your face from me. Do not thrust aside your servant in anger. You have ever been my help. So we've got this other sort of face thing that we see in the Psalms a lot, and also in the prophets, this idea of God turning God's face away from the people, essentially meaning like, I am not going to listen to their suffering. I am not going to, like, usually it's when the people have done something really bad and God is going to turn God's face away from the people. So you've got this sort of double thing going on here where the psalmist is saying, don't hide your face from me. Don't turn away from me. I'm going to seek your face. So we've got this movement of like, I'm trying to get around to the place where we can be in conversation and in relationship again. Albie says, seeing God in the way we connect to each other, we're all striving for those connections and moments where it's like, wow, I'm supposed to know you. Yeah. I like that idea of seeing God's face in others. And that's very biblical, of course. And it's very, again, jumping to the New Testament, that idea of like, when did we see you suffering, Lord? When did we see you in prison or hungry or needing clothes? And then Jesus says, every time you see somebody in the world who needs those things, you're seeing me or you're helping me. So seeing God in others is definitely, that can definitely be a connection here. I wonder about, since I couldn't see you all talking earlier, I wonder about how you feel about that. Well, you know what? I'm gonna skip that bit. I have so many questions here for y'all, and I don't want to go over the ones I shouldn't go over or take time. Luke says, it feels to me, since our face is how the world sees us, the face of God seems like the psalmist wants to know God more, to see how God presents to the world, maybe a bit more clearly than before. Yeah, I like that. I think the idea of seeing somebody face to face is, maybe it's more of like, I understand who this sort of, it's almost like the difference in how like communities talk about God, or how sort of the ideas that we get about God from our traditions. And it's sort of like, there's this sort of community understanding of God, but then we also want to have a personal understanding of God. Does that make sense? So maybe Luke, that's kind of a little bit what you're saying about like knowing God in a sort of one-on-one sense. Like we understand God in sort of a communal sense, but to know God in a one-on-one sense might be different somehow. That's something that I feel like evangelical communities have kind of a lock on, this idea of like you and Jesus as like BFFs. Evangelical communities tend to really talk about that in a way that can be really helpful. In sort of mainline communities, like my Lutheran communities, we talk less about like personal God relationships and more about sort of communal God relationships. And I think there are strengths and weaknesses in both ways of thinking about it. So sort of the last thing that I want to ask it about this bit of text is there a part of this psalm that does give you courage? Because the last verse of Psalm 27 says, I believe that I shall see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord, be strong, and let your heart take courage. Wait for the Lord. The thing, like, is there something about this text that gives you that courage? The be strong and let your heart take courage. Is there something about this text that gives you courage in times that are difficult? And for me, like I've talked a little bit about like parents and being put up on a rock and stuff like that. Maybe some of that resonates with you, or maybe there's another piece that you're like, oh, this bit gives me courage or gives me hope in some way. So let me know if there's a bit here that does that for you. One thing that I really, really like is in that last verse, second to last verse, verse 13, where it says in the NRSV, I believe that I shall see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. That to me is like, that's so, like, that hits me right in my heart. Because it's this idea that it's not going to be after I'm dead and in heaven, or it's not going to be, some long period from now. It means that while I am alive, while I am here, I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. And that to me gives me an incredible amount of hope and courage. Airhawk says, verse 10 in particular, reminding me that God is bigger than whether my parents accept the way I am, and that God is still with me in that. Yeah. Allie says, verse 1 seems to give a lot of hope. Yeah, the Lord is my light and my help. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Whom shall I dread? Yeah, that is a classic verse. People pull that one out all the time. And it's really that idea of like, I don't even have to be afraid because God is with me. That's intense. That's really cool. I like that one too. What other verses you might pull out of this and say like, that one gives me a sense of courage, or that one gives me a sense of hope? Aiden says, agreeing with Airhawk there, I was pulled towards God because God was still with me. That's the reason why I'm still alive. Yeah. I feel you, Aiden. That idea that God is bigger than all of this stuff seems to be a sort of main theme, I think, in this particular psalm. This idea that like God is so much bigger that we don't have to be afraid, that God is so much bigger that God can raise us up in moments where we need to be sort of pulled up above all of this chaos and turmoil. This idea that God is big enough to take us in when our family may not be able to. Yeah, that's this idea of God being like big enough to not have, like, we are within and held by this God that is so much bigger than all of this. Aiden says, I'm glad this is pulling us all together. Aw, cute. So I'm trying to think if there are any other questions that I had for us all as we're thinking about this text. Let's see. I think the last sort of thing that I wanted to talk about is, Luke says, verse 10 is for me too. I also relate to the parent or leader figures in my life who might not be too helpful. The idea that it's okay to step away from those people. Yeah, sometimes we are in a position where we do have to, for our own safety, pull away from people that have been in our lives as caretakers or parental figures. And so the idea that you are not without those things, or you are not without that love and support because God is there. Like verse 10, really good. Shoot, I just forgot the last question that I was going to ask. Hold on, I have to go back and look at it again. Okay, so the last thing that I was going to point out is this idea of moving like how we move through fear, how we move through stress or distress, and seeing Psalm 27 as an interesting way of responding to fear. Because I think a lot of us, like for me, I'll speak for myself. For me, when I look at the world and I see scary things happening, or when scary things are happening in my life, I tend to want to like run away from them, or to what do I even want to do? Curl up in a ball and cry sometimes. The way that I, respond to fear is not usually in the way that the psalmist is responding to fear. The psalmist is responding to fear by talking about how much he trusts God. And that maybe to you, as it does to me, feels like such a weird response. That like, I am terrified and bad things are happening, so I'm going to talk about how much I trust God. And it that moving into praise and trust and verbalizing that just is not my first instinct, I don't think. And so it's interesting to me that the psalmist does that. And I wonder how we can do that in our lives. That's sort of the sort of last thing that this psalm brings me to, is this idea of like, next time I am in a situation that is incredibly stressful or that is distressing in some way, how do I respond to God like the psalmist does? How do I respond? So like, if we sort of diagram this psalm out, right, it starts out with the first verse kind of saying like, God is so big, I don't have to be afraid of anything. Just kind of recognizing like, God is here and that God is in control. So sort of like putting that out there first. And then sort of going into like what's actually going on with the psalmist. Like he kind of talks about like, here's what's going on. I've got, there's an army that might besiege me. And then kind of going into like, here's what I want. What I want is to be with God, to know God, to be lifted up out of this for a little while, to have a bit of a break, to have a place that's safe. So this almost kind of tells God what he wants. And then the last bit kind of being about, you know, God, here's what I'm afraid of. I'm afraid that my father and mother might abandon me. I'm afraid that you might hide your face. I'm afraid of these false witnesses and unjust accusers. And then ending with this idea of like, I'm going to keep looking to God because, you know, God is here and God knows me, and I know I will enjoy the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. So it starts out with confidence and ends with confidence. And in the middle, it's got the psalmist being like, here's what's happening and I'm scared. And so when we think about how we might respond to situations like this, maybe it would be helpful for us to think about responding in a similar way of like, let's remember who God is. Let's remember like that this is not like, I don't have to fix everything, and I don't have to like, there's a bigger presence outside of me that is with me. So let's remember that first of all. And then we can talk about what we want and what we're scared of. And then we can kind of and like end with the idea that like, we know that God hears us. And so that to me is kind of a really interesting way of thinking about how to respond to stress and fear. So I wanted to throw that out there for all of y'all, that maybe it might be helpful for you too. I don't know. So that's about all I have for us today, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with me. I'm sorry I couldn't get the chat working right away. I'll know how to fix that next time. I hope this was sort of, what's the word? I was going to say like calming, but I hope this was encouraging for you if you've been going through a tough time. And I hope that it's something that might be, I hope this text might be helpful for you as something that you can go to when you are stressed and upset and dealing with all of the chaos going on in the world. I hope it's helpful for you. And that's about all I've got. So next week, next Wednesday, we're doing the so I've been, just if you're new to this whole thing, I've been alternating weeks on Wednesdays. So we do one online Bible study like this, and then the next week we do the Trans and Christian Support Group, which is just specifically for gender diverse folks. And that's like a closed group that I do. And then we just keep switching back between the two, open Bible study and then closed support group. So next week is going to be the support group, and we're going to do it at this same time because I've had the same thing where people ask to do it earlier in the day because of time zones and things. So it's going to be the same time next week for the Trans and Christian support group. And if you have already signed up for that, you signed up for it in the past, your name is still on the list, so you don't have to sign up again. But if you do want to sign up and you haven't yet, you can if you go to bit.ly/transchristiansupport. And that will give you the link, and you'll be able to sign up. So that'll be next week. And then the week after that, we'll be back to an open Bible study again. And so let me know in the comments of this video after I go off live here, and it's just a regular video. Let me know in the comments if doing it earlier in the day like this is helpful for you, or if you would rather keep doing them in the evening, and I will take that into consideration as we go forward. Thanks to everybody in the chat who's saying thanks and hi. I'm glad you could make it here to this one too. I hope you all have a wonderful day, wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you back here next time. All right, everybody. Peace.